Bedtime Reading.
Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Chapter 1. Falling Through the Rabbit Hole. It was the middle of the day one summer when Alice, sitting lazily at the edge of the river bank with her sister, became very tired. There was nothing happening and nothing to do. A couple of times she stole a quick look at the book her sister was reading, but it wasn't very interesting, as it had no pictures to look at or interesting conversations to follow. "And what's the use of a book," thought Alice, "without pictures? What's a book if there's no conversation?" She was trying to decide. It was difficult for her, because the hot summer day was not making her feel like making a decision, but very sleepy instead. If she wanted to get up and pick some small wildflowers to make a necklace, when all of a sudden a white rabbit with pink eyes quickly ran past her. There was nothing so terribly unusual in that. Neither did Alice think it very remarkable to hear the rabbit say to himself as he sped past,
"Oh dear, oh dear, I'm late for a very important date."
Thinking about it afterwards, it did occur to her that she ought to have wondered about hearing a white rabbit saying he was late for a date. But at the time, it all seemed quite natural and didn't occur to her in the least. But then the rabbit took a small gold watch out of his coat pocket, looked at the time, and hurried on. Seeing this, Alice jumped to her feet in a flash, for she suddenly realized she had never before seen a rabbit with either a coat pocket or a gold watch to take out of it. Burning with curiosity, she ran away from the river bank and across the field to chase after him. She caught up just in time to see the rabbit jump down a large rabbit hole that was under a low-hanging bush. Without stopping to think, Alice jumped in the hole after him. She didn't even stop to consider where the hole might go, or how in the world she would, or if she could, get out of it again. The dark rabbit hole went straight ahead like a tunnel, the way that rabbit holes do, for quite a while. Then the tunnel suddenly dropped straight down into a deep well. Alice, without any time to even think about stopping herself, fell down and further down the well. It could have been that the well was very deep, or that Alice fell very slowly, for she had plenty of time during her fall to not only look at her surroundings, but also wonder what was going to happen to her next. At first, Alice tried to look down and make out the bottom of the well, and when she was going to stop falling, but it was too dark to see anything. So she looked up, but this was just as dark, and then she got confused about whether she was looking up or down, so she decided to look at the sides of the well. Alice noticed that cupboards and bookshelves filled the sides, and that here and there maps, pictures, and paintings were hung upon wooden boards. She quickly grabbed a jar from one of the shelves as she passed. It was labeled orange jam, but it was empty. Alice was greatly disappointed, for she did so enjoy eating orange jam, and a little taste of jam would have been quite nice. She did not want to just drop the jar, even if it was just an empty jar. She was falling so fast, and she feared she would kill somebody underneath. Instead, she managed to place it into one of the cupboards as she went past. "Well," Alice thought to herself, "after a fall like this, I won't ever be afraid again of falling downstairs at home. How brave they'll think I am when they hear about this. Why, I wouldn't say anything or scream, even if I fell off the roof of my own house." Down, down, and further down she fell. Would the fall ever come to an end? Would she ever be able to tell which way was up or down again? "I wonder how many miles I've gone?" the amazed girl asked aloud. "I'm sure by now I must be nearing the center of the earth. Let me see, I think that would be about 4,000 miles down." Alice had learned several things of this sort at school, and she was proud that she could remember it now, even though her feet were sometimes over her head. Though this was not the best opportunity to show off her knowledge, as there wasn't anybody about to listen to her, still it was good practice to repeat it. "But then, I wonder what location on the globe I've reached," she said. Now, Alice didn't really have the smallest idea what the geography of the world was like, as she hadn't been taught that at school, but she thought it was a very grand idea to have anyway. Presently, she began again. "I wonder if I'm going to fall right through the middle of the earth. When I land, I'll have to ask people what the name of their country is. I shall say, 'Please, ma'am, is this New Zealand or Australia?'" Knowing that it was polite to bow to strangers, especially if you land unexpectedly in the middle of their country, Alice tried to bow like a lady as she spoke. But can you imagine bowing as you're falling through the air? Do you think you could manage it? "What an unknowledgeable, rude little girl! They will consider me for asking where I am," Alice said. "No, it'll never do to ask. It will be best if I say nothing. Perhaps I shall see it written somewhere on a sign." Down, down, down Alice fell. There was nothing else to do, so to pass the time, she soon began talking to herself again about her dearly loved cat, Dinah. "Dinah's going to miss me very much tonight, I should think," she cried. "Oh, I hope the family will remember to give her a bowl of milk at tea time. If they forget, poor Dinah will think she is unloved. Oh, Dinah, my dear, I wish you were here with me. There are no mice in the air, at least any that I can see, I'm afraid, but you could catch a bat, and that's close enough to a mouse, don't you think? But do cats eat bats, I wonder?" And here, because of nothing to do, Alice began to get rather sleepy. She continued talking to herself in a dreamy kind of way, repeating over and over, "Do cats eat bats? Do cats eat bats?" Sometimes she asked, "Do bats eat cats?" For, you see, as she wasn't able to answer either question with certainty, it didn't much matter which way she put it. She felt that she was falling asleep and had just begun to dream that she was walking hand in hand with Dinah. Though it was strange to be walking hand in hand with a cat, she was sincere when she said, "Now, Dinah, tell me the truth. Have you ever eaten a bat? What was it?" Suddenly Alice went thump, thump, thump and landed in a heap of sticks and dry leaves, and the fall was over. Alice was not hurt or injured in the least, and in a second quickly jumped to her feet. She looked up, but it was all dark overhead. Still, she was very happy she could finally tell which way was up again. In front of her was another long passage, and she just managed to catch sight of the white rabbit hurrying down it. There was not a moment to lose. Away flew Alice like the wind, and was just in time to hear him say, as he turned around a corner,
"Oh, my ears and whiskers! How late it's getting!"
She was just ready to catch up with him when she went around the corner, but, to her surprise, the rabbit was nowhere to be seen. Alice found herself entering a long hall with a low ceiling. The hall was lit by a row of hanging lamps. There were doors on all sides of the hall, but they were all locked. Alice walked down one side and up the other, trying every door, but no use. She walked sadly down the middle and began to wonder how she would ever get out again. Suddenly, Alice saw a little three-legged table made completely of solid glass. There was nothing on the table but a tiny gold key. What other use can there be for this key? It must belong to one of the doors in this hall, thought Alice. But alas! The locks were either too large or too small for the key. The key would not open a single door. However, going up and down the hall once more, Alice noticed a low curtain she had not seen before. Behind the curtain was a little door only 15 inches high. She put the gold key in the lock, tried it, and to her delight it worked. Alice opened the door and saw that it led into a small passage, not much bigger than a hole for a rat. Getting down on her knees, she saw that the passage led into one of the loveliest gardens she'd ever seen. How she truly wished to leave the dark hall and walk about among those beds of bright flowers. How she wished to be able to rest by those cool fountains. But oh dear, she couldn't even fit her head through the doorway. Even if my head would go through, she thought, it would be of little use without my shoulders. Whoever heard of a head that was without shoulders? Oh, how I wish I could close up like a folding toy. I think I could if I only knew how. So many strange and odd things had happened since she fell down the rabbit hole that Alice was beginning to think that very few things were indeed impossible. There didn't seem to be any use in waiting around by the little door, so Alice went back to the table, hoping to find another key perhaps, or, at any rate, at least a book of instructions about folding oneself up like a small telescope. This time, however, she found an interesting little bottle, which certainly wasn't there before. Around the neck of the bottle was a sign with large, beautifully painted words that said, "Drink me." It was all very well for a bottle to have a sign that said, "Drink me." But Alice was not a foolish girl, and didn't think it wise to do such a thing in a hurry. "No, I'll look first," she thought, and see if it's marked poison. In school, she had read many unpleasant little stories about children burning themselves or even being eaten up by wild animals, all because they didn't remember or pay attention to the simple rules their parents and teachers had taught them. One such rule was that a fire iron stuck in the fire for a long time will definitely burn you if you hold it too long. Secondly, cutting your finger very deeply with a knife will make it bleed. Most importantly, she remembered that if you drink much from a bottle marked poison, it will almost certainly disagree with you at some time or another. However, this little bottle seemed to be perfectly harmless, so Alice decided to taste it and found it delicious. It reminded her of her favorite dinner, even though the flavor was a little mixed up: cherry pie, custard, pineapple, roast turkey, candy, and hot buttered toast. She soon finished off the whole bottle. "What a strange feeling!" exclaimed Alice. "I must be closing up, just like a telescope." Curiously enough, that's exactly what was happening. Soon, Alice was about 10 inches high, and her face became very bright when she realized that now she might be the right size to pass through the little rat-sized door into that lovely garden. First, however, she decided to wait a few minutes to see if she was going to shrink any more. Nervously, she thought, "For it might end up, you know," Alice said to herself, "that I become too small altogether and disappear like the end of a candle that's finished up. I wonder what I would be like then." And she tried to imagine what the flame of a candle looks like after the candle is all used up, and to her disappointment, she could not remember ever having seen a flame without a candle. After waiting a while and seeing that nothing more happened, she decided to head for the garden. But bad luck for poor Alice. When she reached the door, she realized that she had forgotten to bring the little gold key. Quickly, she ran back to the table to get it, but she found that now there was no possible way for her to reach it. Through the bottom of the table, for the table was made of glass, Alice could see the key quite plainly. She tried her best to climb up one of the legs, but it was too slippery, and she just kept falling down. Soon she had tired herself out, climbing and slipping, so poor, very tired Alice just sat down and started crying. "Come now, what good is it in crying like that?" Alice lectured herself. "I tell you to stop this instantly." She often gave herself quite good advice, but she also seldom followed it. Sometimes she would scold herself so strongly that she made herself cry. Once, she remembered even trying to hit her own ears for having cheated herself in a game of croquet she was playing against herself. This curious little girl often liked to pretend to be two people. "But it's of no use now," Alice thought, "to pretend to be two people. Why, I'm so small that I'm hardly even one complete person now," she thought sadly. Then she saw a little glass box lying under the table. When she opened it, there was a small cake on which the words "Eat me" had been written using small berries. "Well, I guess I should eat it," said Alice, "and hopefully it will make me grow larger so I can reach the key on the table. If this doesn't work but makes me grow smaller instead, then I can creep under the door. Either way, I'll get into the garden." Carefully, she ate just a tiny crumb of the cake and then held her hand on the top of her head to see if she was getting larger or smaller. However, nothing happened, and she was quite disappointed to see that she was still only 10 inches tall. Of course, this is what usually happens when a person eats cake. But remember that by now, Alice had gotten so used to strange and unexpected things happening that it didn't seem quite right for life to carry on in the same way. In fact, it seemed quite stupid and dull. So she set to work and ate every little bit of the cake. Chapter 2. Alice Cries a Lake of Tears. "Life is getting more and more curiouser," said Alice, who suddenly realized that she was also forgetting how to speak good and proper English. Perhaps it was the cake, but what did grammar have to do with making one smaller or larger? Suddenly she cried, "Now I'm getting larger and larger, like the largest telescope in the world." Looking down at the ground, she saw to her amazement that her feet were so far away from her head that they were almost out of sight. "Goodbye, feet," she cried out to them. "Oh, my poor little feet! I wonder who is going to put on your shoes and stockings now, dears? I surely won't be able to. I'm much too far away to take care of you myself. Dear feet, you must manage to do the best you can," she said. Still, she thought, I must be kind to them, or perhaps they won't walk or step the way I want to go. Let me think a while. Oh, yes, I'll give them a new pair of boots at Christmas every year. And she went on planning to herself how she would manage such a thing. How funny it'll be, sending presents to my own feet. Oh, what strange nonsense I'm talking. Alice started to wonder why she was thinking such strange thoughts when all of a sudden her head hit the roof of the hall. Now she was more than 9 feet tall. Quickly, Alice picked up the little gold key and ran off to the garden door. But poor Alice, all she could manage, now that she was so large, was to lie on her side and look with one eye through the passage into the garden. Getting through to the garden was even more hopeless than before. Sad and defeated, she again burst into tears. "You ought to be ashamed of yourself," Alice scolded herself once again. "Such a great girl like you, crying in this manner. Stop this moment, I tell you," she commanded herself. But Alice went on crying all the same, crying until there was a large pool of her own tears around her, about 4 inches deep, that reached halfway down the hall. Soon she heard the soft sound of feet coming from a distance. Hastily she dried her eyes because she couldn't see who was coming through all her tears. Who would it be but the White Rabbit returning, splendidly dressed, with a pair of white kid gloves in one hand and a large fan in the other. Again, he was hopping along like he was in a great hurry. He kept repeating to himself, over and over,
"Oh, the Duchess! The Duchess! Oh, think how angry she'll be if I've kept her waiting."
Alice was so desperate for help that she was ready to ask anybody. So, when the rabbit came near, she went up to him quite shyly and said, "If you please, sir." But to Alice's surprise, the rabbit stopped when he saw her and hurriedly ran away, dropping his white kid gloves and fan. He sped away into the darkness as fast as he could go. Alice decided to pick up the fan and gloves. As the hall was very hot, she started to madly fan herself while continuing to talk to herself. "Dear, oh dear, how terribly strange everything is today," she said in a confused voice. "Yesterday, things were just as usual. I wonder if it's me who has changed in the night. Let me see if I can remember. Am I sure that I was the same person as last night when I got up this morning? I think I can almost remember feeling just a little different. But if I'm not the same, then who in the world am I? Ah, there's a big puzzle for me." Alice started to think of all the other little girls she knew that were of the same age as herself. She was trying to figure out if she might have been exchanged for any of them. "I'm almost definitely sure I'm not Ada," she said, "for her hair has such long curls, and mine is not curly in the least. I'm sure I can't be Mabel, for I know all sorts of facts and smart things, and she knows hardly any. Besides, she's she, and I'm I, and, oh dear, how puzzling this is all becoming." As she was speaking, the wheels in Alice's mind kept turning around and around. "Maybe I should try to remember all the things I used to know. Let me see. 4 times 7 is... Oh dear! I shall never get to finish if I start this way. Let's try geography. London is the capital of Paris, and Paris is the capital of Rome. Oh no, that's all wrong. I'm quite sure. Oh dear, I must have been changed in the middle of the night for Mabel. Maybe I should repeat, how doth the little... Thus she folded her hands on her lap, as if she were repeating her school lessons. But her voice sounded dry and strange, and the words would not come out in quite the same way as they used to. How doth the little crocodile improve his shining tail, and pour the waters of the Nile on every golden scale? How cheerfully he seems to grin, how neatly spreads his claws, and welcomes little fishes in with gently smiling jaws. Oh, certainly those are not the right words, said Alice, and she started to cry again. Her eyes filled again with tears, but she continued. I must be Mabel after all. I shall have to go and live in her ugly little house, and hardly have any toys to play with at all. Plus, I'll have so many lessons to learn again. Well, what am I to do? No, I've made up my mind about it. If I'm Mabel, then I'm staying down here. Even if someone were to put their head down the hole and say, 'Come up again, dear,' it'll be of no use. I will have to look up and ask, 'Who am I, then?'" Alice took a deep breath, stopped all her thinking for a moment, and then continued. "So tell me who I am first. If I like being that person, then I'll come up. If I don't, then I'll stay down here till I hear the right name and I become somebody else." "But, oh dear," the confused girl cried, with another sudden burst of tears, "I do wish somebody would come along and put his head down here. I'm so very, very tired of being alone." As she was speaking, Alice had put on one of the rabbit's white kid gloves. She was surprised when she looked down and realized what she had done. "How could I have managed to do that?" she wondered. "I must be growing small again." She got up and went to the table to measure her height against it. As much as it was possible to guess, she was now only about 2 feet high. To make matters worse, she was continuing to shrink even more rapidly. She soon realized that she had been furiously fanning herself smaller. Quickly, she dropped the fan, just in time to save herself from shrinking away altogether. "That was close," said Alice, frightened at the sudden change in her height. But she was very glad to find that she was small enough to go into the garden. The determined girl quickly ran back to the little door, but it was shut again, and she remembered putting the gold key back on the glass table. "Things are worse than ever," cried Alice, "for I never was this small before, never, and I definitely say it's too bad that I forgot to carry the key." At that moment her foot slipped, and in another moment, splash! She was swimming up to her chin in salty water. Alice first thought that she had somehow fallen into the sea, but then she realized that she was in the lake of tears which she had cried when she was 9 feet tall. "Dear me! I wish I hadn't cried so much before," said Alice, as she swam about the lake, trying to find her way out. "Now I'm going to be punished by drowning in my own tears. That will be odd, to be sure. However, everything is odd today." Suddenly, she heard something splashing not very far away in the lake. At first, because of the noise, she thought it must be some large animal, like a walrus or a hippopotamus. Then she remembered how small she had become, and was quite surprised to see what was splashing about was only a mouse. "I wonder if it's of any use," thought Alice, speaking to this mouse. "Everything is so strange down here that I'm sure it's very likely he can talk. At any rate, there's no harm in trying to speak to him. I hope he won't run away like that rabbit." So she began. "Oh, Mouse," she cried out, "do you know how I can get out of this lake? I'm so very tired of swimming here. Oh, Mouse!" Alice guessed that this must be the right way of addressing a mouse, although she had never addressed a mouse before. The mouse looked at her rather oddly and then winked at her with one eye. Yet he didn't say anything. "Perhaps he doesn't speak English," thought Alice. "My guess is that he's one of those French mice that came here with William the Conqueror." However, the imaginative girl, despite all her knowledge of history, didn't seem to have the tiniest idea how long ago William the Conqueror had come. Alice couldn't remember how to say hello in French, so she decided to ask him the first question that was in her French lesson book. Où est ma chatte? She did know, of course, that in English that meant, "Where is my cat?" The mouse quickly leapt out of the water like lightning and started to shake all over with fright. "Oh, I'm very sorry," cried Alice to the mouse. She was afraid she had hurt the little animal's feelings. "I completely forgot. You didn't like cats."
Not like cats,
the mouse replied, shaking from fright and anger.
I'm sure you wouldn't like cats either if you were me.
"Well, probably not," admitted Alice, trying to speak calmly so that she wouldn't anger the mouse again. "But don't be angry about it. I'm sure that if you could meet my cat, Dinah, you'd start to take a liking to cats." "She is such a good and sweet cat," Alice continued, swimming lazily in the pool. "She likes to sit and purr by the fire, licking her sweet paws and washing her whiskers. She's also rather good at catching mice, too." "Oh, how horrible of me! I do beg your pardon," cried Alice again, realizing that she had again upset the mouse. "I promise I won't mention Dinah any more, if it will make you feel better."
Yes, indeed,
cried the mouse, who was still shaking from his head to the end of his tail.
As if I would even think about talking of such a subject. My family has always hated cats. They are such nasty, mean, low, worthless things. Don't let me hear you speak about it again."
"Indeed I won't," said Alice, trying to change the subject to a more friendly one. Are you fond of dogs?" The mouse did not say anything, so Alice eagerly went on. "There is such a sweet little dog that lives near our house, a bright-eyed puppy that can fetch sticks when you throw them for fun. He sits and begs for his food and can do all sorts of tricks. Actually, his owner is a farmer who says that his dog can kill all the rats on the farm, and—" "Oh, dear," realized Alice, "I'm afraid I've upset you again by saying too much." And right she was, for the mouse was swimming away as fast as he could. This was making quite a lot of noise in the pool, too. Alice decided to try once more and called softly after him. "Mouse dear, please come back. I promise I won't talk about either cats or dogs, since I can't say anything that will upset you." Hearing this, the mouse turned around and slowly swam back to Alice. His face was quite white from fright, and he said in a low, shaky voice,
"Let's swim to the shore, and then I'll tell you my life story. Perhaps then you will be able to understand why I hate cats and dogs."
The mouse couldn't have suggested a better plan, for the lake was getting rather crowded all of a sudden, with all the birds and animals that had fallen into it. Alice could not believe her own eyes. She looked at the great lake that had once been her own tears. It was odd enough that she had once been big enough to cry a lake of tears, big enough for her and the mouse to swim in. But now there was barely room for the two of them. Creatures of every kind were swimming in it as well. There was a duck and a dodo, a big and clumsy bird that cannot fly. Also in the lake were a brightly colored bird known as a lory, a baby eagle, and several other strange and curious creatures that Alice didn't even recognize. As if she were the leader of this strange group of animals, Alice led the way, and the whole party followed her, swimming to the shore. Chapter 3. A Party Race and a Long Story. The creatures that gathered together on the bank, birds with their wet and messy feathers, animals with their fur sticking to them, were all dripping wet. They were angry, too, because they were uncomfortable and wanted to be dry. Getting dry became the first topic of conversation. They talked for a little while about this, and after a few minutes, Alice started to feel more and more comfortable in their company. She felt that these were friends she had known all her life. Unfortunately, she got into another unpleasant argument with the brightly colored lory, who became very stubborn and would only say,
"I'm older than you and must know better."
However, Alice didn't believe that the lory was right. She did not know how old he was, and he would not tell her. She decided it was best just not to speak any more with him. Finally, the mouse, who seemed to be the group's leader, called out and said,
"Sit down, all of you, and listen to me. I can make you dry quickly enough."
Quickly, they all sat down in a large circle, and the mouse was left standing in the middle. Alice did not take her eyes off him the whole time, for she wanted to get dry and felt sure that if she didn't, she would indeed catch a bad cold.
"Ahem,"
said the mouse, using an authoritative voice.
"Are you all ready? This is the driest thing I know."
And thus he began such a long and boring story about English history that the whole group was nearly put to sleep.
"Ugh,"
said the dodo, shaking his feathers.
"I do beg your pardon,"
replied the mouse, who was quite unhappy that the dodo had nearly fallen asleep. Still, he tried to be polite and asked,
"Did you say something?" "I'm sorry to complain, but I am still as wet as when I came to shore,"
the poor, bored dodo explained.
"I have an idea. How about having a party race?"
"What in the world is a party race?" inquired Alice after no one else said anything.
"Oh, it's like a kind of meeting,"
said the unsure dodo, who by now was walking around proudly and flapping his wings, trying to look important, too.
"Yes, I know it's a meeting of people together who belong to a party. You know, it's similar to a political meeting. I heard it from someone once before, though I can't remember who it was."
"Well," said Alice, trying to get involved in the conversation, "there's quite a party of us here right now, certainly enough to have an election of sorts. But what, may I ask, is a party race?"
I think the best way to explain it is just to do it,
said the dodo. Having spoken, he made a great flying leap at a branch from a flower bush and began to mark out a race course that looked awfully like a circle. Once he had finished this, the big bird made everyone in his party stand at various spots along the course. Unlike other races Alice had been to, no one called out, 1, 2, 3, go. But all the creatures on the shore started to run around. Then they stopped whenever they felt like it. Therefore, it was not easy for Alice to know when the race was actually over. However, after they had been running for half an hour or so, they were quite dry again. Suddenly, the dodo shouted,
"The race is over."
"But who is the winner?" all the birds and animals cried. Tired and out of breath, they crowded around him. The dodo was not able to answer this question without a great deal of thought, and he stood still for a long time with one feathered finger pressed upon his forehead, while the party waited silently. At last the dodo decided.
"Everybody has won,"
he shouted.
"and everyone is going to get a prize."
"But which one of us is going to present the prizes?" a voice cried.
"Why, Alice will, of course,"
said the dodo, pointing at her. The whole party now gathered around Alice, calling out, "Prizes! Prizes!" Alice didn't have the tiniest idea what to do, and as a last hope, she reached into her pocket. She pulled out a handful of candy to pass around as prizes. Luckily, Alice was able to give exactly one piece to each of the runners in the race.
"But one moment. Alice doesn't have a prize herself, and she must have a prize because she took part in the race,"
the mouse declared.
"This is true,"
the dodo replied, very seriously.
"Have you got anything else in your pocket?"
he asked. "Only this small tool I use for sewing," said Alice sadly.
"Give it to me,"
said the dodo. The animals all crowded around her once again, while the dodo, in a grave manner, presented the sewing tool, saying,
"We beg your acceptance of this beautiful thing."
When he had finished, the animals all clapped and cheered for Alice. Alice really wanted to laugh because she thought the whole thing was quite ridiculous. But the little group all looked so serious that she did not dare to. Trying to look serious as well, Alice simply bowed and took back the sewing tool, for she could not think of anything to say. Then the little group had to eat their candy. This caused quite a lot of confusion. The large birds complained that they could not taste their candy, and the little birds began to choke after eating theirs. A lot of creatures had to be patted on the back. However, soon it was over at last, and they again sat down in a circle. "You promised me you would tell me all about yourself," said Alice to the mouse, "and also explain why you hate cats and dogs." This last part she added in a whisper, half afraid that the mouse would get angry again.
"Mine is a long and sad tale,"
said the mouse, looking at Alice and sighing. "You do have a long tail, I can see that," she answered, looking in wonder at the mouse's tail. "But why do you say that your tail is sad?" But the mouse didn't pay any attention to Alice and began to talk. Alice was a little confused, and so her idea of his story was something like this. Anger said to a mouse that he met in the house,
"Let us go to the law. I will judge you. Come, I'll take no argument. We must have the trial, for really this morning I've nothing to do,"
said the mouse to the cat.
"Such a trial, dear sir, with no jury or judge, would be wasting our breath. I'll be the judge, I'll be the jury,"
said the cunning old Anger.
"I'll try the whole cause and sentence you to death." "I don't think you're listening to me,"
said the unhappy mouse to Alice.
"You've hurt me again by not paying any attention."
"I didn't mean it," said poor Alice, "but you are quite easily made upset." The mouse only walked away in reply. "Oh, Mouse, please come back and finish your story," Alice called to him. Suddenly, all the other creatures said together, "Please do." But the mouse, as he was tired of their company, only shook his head and walked a little faster.
"What a pity he wouldn't stay,"
cried the Lory, now that the mouse was out of sight. An old crab used the opportunity as a lesson for her daughter, saying, "Now, my dear, let this be a lesson about why you should never lose your temper." But the young crab was an impolite child and replied, "Oh, please don't say anything, Ma. You're old enough to test the patience even of an oyster." "I wish that Dinah was here with me," said Alice, to no one in particular. "I know she would soon bring the mouse back."
"And who is this Dinah?"
asked the Lory. "Dinah's my sweet cat," Alice replied eagerly, and her whole face brightened as she spoke. "You can't even guess at how good she is at catching mice. And oh, I wish you could see how good she is at chasing birds, too. Why, she'd eat a little bird as quickly as she'd look at it." The speech did not have a good effect among the party of creatures. Some of the birds moved their wings nervously and flew away at once. "Oh, it's time that I left and returned home," said one old magpie, gathering her belongings together. The night air gives me a sore throat." A canary called out to her children in a shaky voice, "Come along, children. I think it's your bedtime." Giving various excuses, all the creatures left, and poor Alice was once again all alone. "Oh, I shouldn't have mentioned Dinah again," she said to herself sadly. "Nobody seems to like hearing about her down here, even though I know she's the best cat in the world. Oh, my dearest Dinah, do you think I shall ever see you again?" Here, poor Alice sat upon a tree stump and began to cry again. However, in a little while she heard the soft sound of footsteps approaching in the distance. She looked up, hoping to see the mouse coming back to finish his story. Chapter 4. The rabbit decides to send in a little bill for help. But it wasn't the mouse or even any of the other creatures. It was the white rabbit running back again. He was looking anxiously about, like he had lost something important.
"The Duchess! The Duchess!"
he cried.
"Oh, my dear paws! Oh, my fur and whiskers! She's going to kill me! Where could I have dropped those things?"
Alice guessed that he must be looking for his fan and white kid gloves since he had dropped those things earlier in the hallway. She decided to good-naturedly join in the hunt, but she wasn't able to see the rabbit's belongings anywhere. In fact, everything was different since her swim in the pool. The great hall, the glass table, and the little door had all completely vanished. The rabbit stopped in front of Alice and rudely called to her,
"Why, Mary Ann, what on earth are you doing down here? Run home this minute and bring me a pair of gloves and my fan. Be quick about it now."
"I think he's mistaken me for his housemaid," said Alice. Quickly, as she was frightened about upsetting the rabbit even further, she ran off in the direction of the rabbit's house. "I'm sure he'll be very surprised when he finds out I'm not Mary Ann. But I'd better first bring him his fan and gloves if I can find them again." Alice had not thought this any more when she saw a neat little house. There was a metal plate on the door with the words W. Rabbit written on it. Not stopping to knock, she went inside and hurried upstairs to find the fan and gloves in case she was to meet the real Mary Ann, who she feared might tell her to get out of the house. "How strange it is," Alice remarked to herself, "to be bringing gloves and a fan to a rabbit. I suppose my cat Dinah will be sending me to do things like this next." She had soon wandered into a small little room, where she found a pair of gloves and a fan on a table. Just as she was leaving, she noticed a bottle near the looking-glass or mirror. Although there was no sign saying "Drink me" on the bottle, Alice took off the cap and took a little drink. "I know that something interesting is going to happen," she whispered to herself. "Whenever I eat or drink anything in this place, I hope I will grow large again, for I'm really tired of being such a small little creature." Before she had drunk half the bottle, her head pressed against the ceiling, and she had to bend down to keep her neck and head from being squeezed. This happened much sooner than she had expected, making her feel very uncomfortable. Quickly, she put the bottle down and said, "That's quite enough for now. I hope I won't be growing any more. Right now, I can't even get out of the door. Dear me, I wish I hadn't drunk as much as I did." It was too late for such wishes. Alice continued to grow until she was down on the floor on her knees. By the next minute, she had to lie down on the floor, with one elbow against the door and the other curled around her head to fit inside the room. Still, she went on growing. As a last attempt, she moved one arm out of the window and her foot into the fireplace and up the chimney. Luckily for her, there wasn't a fire in the fireplace. Soon she stopped growing. Alice was quite relieved. It was much more pleasant at home, Alice remembered. At least there I wasn't always growing larger or becoming smaller. Plus, I didn't have to be ordered about by mice and rabbits. I almost wish I hadn't fallen down that rabbit hole. Still, it's rather curious and interesting, this kind of life. I used to read fairy tales, thinking that things like this would never happen. Now, I find myself here, right in the middle of one." Suddenly, Alice heard the rabbit's voice outside.
"Marianne! Marianne!"
he cried urgently.
"Bring me my gloves right now."
Then came the sound of his soft feet on the stairs. Alice knew he would soon find her. She started to shake all over from fright, making the house shake as well. She forgot that she was now about 1,000 times larger than the rabbit, and didn't have any reason to be afraid of him. Soon the rabbit reached the door and was trying to open it, but Alice had pushed her elbow against the door, and there was no way for the rabbit to get in. Just then she heard him say to himself,
"I'll just have to go around and climb in a window."
"Oh, no, you won't," said Alice, determined. Just when she heard the rabbit under the window, she reached out with her hand and tried to grab him. Although she was not able to catch him, she heard the rabbit scream, fall, and crash into what sounded like a lot of glass. She supposed that the rabbit had fallen into the vegetable garden house. It was a while before Alice heard anything. Then at last she heard the approaching sound of a wagon, which seemed to be carrying a lot of people who were all talking at the same time. Occasionally, she was able to make out a sentence or two. "Where's the ladder? Bill's got the other. Bill, bring it here. Catch hold of that rope. Will the roof hold up? Watch that loose piece. Oh, it's coming down. Who's going to go down the chimney? Here, Bill. It looks like you've got to go down the chimney." "Oh, so they are going to send Bill down the chimney, are they?" said Alice to herself. "Why, I'm glad I'm not him, because even though this fireplace is pretty small, I think I can still kick a little. And that's exactly what I'm going to do." Alice pushed her foot up the chimney as far as it would go, and waited until she heard the sound of a little animal scratching and moving in the space above her. "That must be Bill," she said, and made one swift kick. Then she waited to see what was going to happen next. "There goes Bill!" the voices outside cried. Then the rabbit shouted,
"Catch him! He's over there by the bushes."
Silence followed, and then she heard a lot of worried voices talking away. "Make sure to hold up his head. Now, don't break his neck. Hey, old fellow, tell us, what happened to you?" At last, Alice heard a little, weak, squeaking voice that she knew must be Bill.
"I'm not exactly sure. Seems like something came at me like a springing toy, and I went flying up into the air like a skyrocket."
"You certainly did, old fellow!" cried the crowd.
"We have to burn down the house,"
exclaimed the rabbit. "If you even think about trying, I'm going to send Dinah after all of you," Alice yelled as loud as she could. Instantly, the crowd was silent. Alice began to wonder to herself about what they were going to do next. "If they have any sense, then they will take the roof off," she thought. After a few minutes had passed, Alice heard the rabbit say,
"I think a huge bucket will do to begin with."
"A bucket of what?" wondered Alice. To her surprise, a shower of little rocks were thrown against the window. Some even hit her in the face. "I'd better put a stop to this," she shouted. "You had better not do that again." All she heard was more silence. Alice soon noticed that the pebbles were all amazingly turning into little, delicious cakes. "Maybe if I eat one of these, it will surely change my size. Since I can't possibly get any larger, I'm sure these must make me smaller." She ate one of the little cakes and was happy to find that she began getting smaller almost at once. When she was small enough to fit through the door, she quickly ran outside and discovered that a crowd of little animals and birds were waiting for her. Poor little Lizard Bill was in the middle of the crowd, held up by 2 guinea pigs who were making him drink something out of a bottle. They all ran towards Alice when they saw her, but she ran off as fast as she could and soon found herself safe in the middle of a thick wood. "The first thing I've got to fix," Alice told herself, as she wandered about in the quiet forest, "is my size. I've got to become my right size again. The second thing I'll do is to find my way back into that lovely garden. I think this is the plan I should use. It's certainly the best." No doubt it sounded like an excellent plan. However, there was the difficulty of not knowing how to carry out the plan. She didn't really have the slightest idea. While she was anxiously looking among the trees, she heard what sounded like a sharp little bark just over her head. She immediately looked up. An enormous puppy, larger than she had ever dreamed possible, was looking down at her. It had large round eyes and was carefully stretching out one paw, trying to touch her. "What a poor little thing," said Alice in a friendly manner, and she tried to whistle to him. But she stopped herself all of a sudden. She became terribly frightened because it occurred to her that the puppy might be hungry and could decide to eat her, even though she was just being friendly. Hardly knowing what to do, she picked up a stick and held it out for the puppy to see. He jumped off his feet high up into the air and with a delightful bark rushed to bring back the stick. Alice had to hide behind a huge flower to make sure he didn't run her over. When Alice came around the other side of the flower, the puppy made another rush forward and fell head over heels in his hurry to bring back the stick. Alice, very worried about being run over by his feet at any moment, ran and hid behind the flower again. The puppy began to play with the stick. He made a series of short charges at the stick, running a little way forward and then a long way back, barking loudly. Finally, he lay down quite far away from Alice, sighed heavily, and his tongue was hanging out of his mouth. His large, sleepy eyes were already half shut. This seemed like a good opportunity for Alice to make her escape, so she ran away at once. She ran until she was out of breath and was far enough away that the puppy's bark was barely heard in the distance. "What a shame! What a dear little puppy it was!" said Alice, as she leaned against another large yellow flower to rest and fanned herself with one of its leaves. "I really would have enjoyed teaching him some more tricks. but I'm not the right size to do it. Oh, dear. I'd almost forgotten I have to grow big again. Let me think. How should I do it? I guess I should start by eating or drinking something. But the important question is, what? Looking around at the flowers and blades of grass, Alice did not see anything that might be suitable for her situation. Finally, she spotted a large mushroom that was about as tall as she was. Alice looked around the mushroom and under the mushroom, but didn't see anything. Then she decided to look at the top of it. Alice had to stand on the tips of her toes to look over the edge of the mushroom. Her eyes instantly met the eyes of a large blue caterpillar that was sitting on the top with his many arms folded. This interesting creature was also smoking a long hookah, which is also known as a water pipe. However, he didn't seem much interested in her, though, and did not pay the slightest attention to her or to anything else. Chapter 5. The Caterpillar Gives Some Advice. The caterpillar and Alice both looked silently at each other for what seemed like quite a long time. At last, the caterpillar stopped smoking, took the hookah out of his mouth, and addressed Alice in a lazy, sleepy voice.
"Who are you?"
he asked. I don't really know, sir, just at present, Alice replied shyly. I remember who I was when I woke up this morning, but I've changed many times since this morning.
"And what do you mean by that?"
said the caterpillar, who was becoming more interested in Alice.
"Explain yourself."
I'm afraid I can't explain myself, sir, said Alice, because I'm really not myself.
"I don't see,"
said the caterpillar. Sorry, I can't explain things more clearly, Alice replied politely, for I don't understand it myself. I've been so many sizes today that I'm feeling very confused.
"No, I still don't understand why you're confused,"
replied the caterpillar. Well, perhaps you haven't had a similar experience yourself yet, Alice said. But when the time comes that you have to enter into your next stage of life, and after that into a beautiful butterfly, I would think you will find it rather strange. And you wouldn't be able to help feeling confused. Don't you think so?
"Not a bit,"
said the caterpillar. Well, perhaps your feelings are quite different, Alice replied quickly. She was becoming impatient with the uncaring caterpillar. All I know is that it's happening to me, and I feel very odd.
"You?
cried the angry caterpillar.
Who are you?"
he asked again. Now they were back to the same point in the conversation they had begun with. Alice was quite a bit angry at the caterpillar for making such rude remarks. She stood up straight and tall, held in her breath, and said, very seriously, I demand that you tell me who you are first.
"Why?"
asked the caterpillar. Another ridiculous question, thought Alice, when she couldn't think of an answer. Since the caterpillar seemed to be in a very bad and disagreeable mood, she angrily walked off.
"Come back,"
he called after her.
"I've something important to say."
This was a positive turn of events, thought Alice. and turned around. After all, she thought, he might even tell her something that was worth hearing. For a few minutes, the caterpillar smoked his hookah without speaking, but at last he again folded his arms, took the hookah pipe out of his mouth, and said,
"So, you think you've changed, do you?"
"I'm sure I have, sir," said Alice, "and none too little."
"What size is it that you want to be?"
"Oh, I don't really care about size," Alice replied quickly. "I'm just tired of changing all the time, you know."
"I don't know,"
said the caterpillar. Alice said nothing, because she knew she was close to losing her temper and shouting very unpleasant answers back at the caterpillar.
"Are you happy now?"
asked the caterpillar. "Well, I wouldn't mind being a little larger than I am now, sir, if you wouldn't mind helping me," answered Alice. "Only 3 inches is such an awful height to be."
"It is a very good height,"
replied the caterpillar angrily, as he was only about 3 inches himself. He sat upright as much as he could and began again. "But it's not the height I'm used to," begged Alice.
"You'll get comfortable with it in a short time,"
said the caterpillar. With that, he started to smoke his hookah again. This time, Alice decided to patiently wait until he chose to speak again. In a minute or two, the caterpillar stopped smoking, took the hookah out of his mouth, yawned, and shook himself. Then he moved off the mushroom with his many hands and crawled away into the grass, remarking as he went away,
"One side will make you grow taller, and the other side will make you grow shorter."
"One side of what? The other side of what?" Alice wondered. Just as she was about to ask, the caterpillar answered,
"Of the mushroom."
It was just as if she had asked the question aloud. When she looked for the caterpillar, she discovered that he had disappeared. Alice looked thoughtfully at the mushroom for a minute or two. Then she reached as far as she could with her arms and tore off a small bit of the edge with each hand. "And now I wonder which is which," she asked herself, eating just a little of the bit out of her right hand. She waited to see the effect. The next moment, her chin was down at her feet. Her chin was so tightly pressed against her feet that she could barely open her mouth. However, she finally was able to swallow a tiny piece from her left hand. "My head's free at last," said Alice delightfully. But she soon became alarmed when she found that she couldn't even see her own shoulders. In fact, all she could see when she looked down was her enormously long neck, which looked like a tall plant that was growing out of a sea of green leaves far below her. "I wonder what that sea of green is," asked Alice. "Where have my shoulders gone? Oh, my poor hands! I can't even see you." Because there wasn't any way to bring her hands up to her head, she decided to try and bring her head down to them. She was surprised to find that her neck was able to bend easily in all directions, like a snake. She was able to curve it downwards into a nice bend and soon discovered that she had been looking at the tops of the trees. A loud hissing sound made her go back in a hurry. A rather big pigeon had flown directly up to her face and was starting to beat her with its wings.
"Snake?"
screamed the pigeon. "I'm not a snake," said Alice, upset at being called such an ugly creature. "Leave me alone."
"Snake, I say again,"
loudly cried the pigeon.
"Oh, how I hate snakes! I have been watching out for snakes both night and day. Why, I haven't been able to sleep in weeks."
"I'm very sorry to hear that you've been bothered and upset because of snakes," said Alice, who was starting to feel quite sorry for the bird.
"Just as I thought I was free from all snakes since I was in the highest tree in the woods,"
continued the pigeon, whose voice was becoming a high scream,
"one of them comes down from the sky."
"But I'm not a snake, I tell you," said Alice. I'm a...
"Well, what are you then?"
inquired the pigeon. "I'm just a little girl," explained Alice, although she was beginning to doubt this herself, remembering all the changes she had been through that day.
"That sounds all very nice,"
said the pigeon hatefully.
"I've seen many little girls before, but never have I seen one with such a neck as yours. No, no. You're indeed a snake, and there's no use in saying you're not. I suppose you're going to tell me next that you've never tasted an egg before either."
"Of course I've tasted eggs," said Alice, who was a very truthful girl. "Little girls like to eat eggs as often as snakes do, you know."
"I don't believe you,"
said the pigeon.
"But if they do like to eat eggs, why, then they must also be a kind of snake. That's all I can say."
The pigeon's idea was so new to Alice that she had to be silent for a minute or two. The pigeon took the opportunity to add,
"I know you're looking for eggs. I know that as well as I could know anything else. What difference does it make to me whether you're a little girl or a snake?"
"It matters quite a bit to me," replied Alice hastily. "But as it is, I'm not looking for any eggs. If I was, I wouldn't want yours anyway. I don't like to eat eggs that aren't cooked."
"Well, go away then,"
said the pigeon unpleasantly, as he settled down in his nest. Alice bent down again among the trees, but her neck kept getting caught among the branches. Every now and then she had to stop and untwist it. After a while she remembered still holding the pieces of mushroom in her hands, so she began taking tiny bits first at one and then at the other. Sometimes she would grow taller and sometimes shorter. Finally, after eating many little pieces, she managed to bring herself back down to her normal height. It felt really strange to be her normal height again, but she got used to it again after a few minutes. Soon, she was even talking to herself in her usual way. "Now, that's half my plan finished. The next thing is to return to that beautiful garden, but how in the world am I going to do that?" As she was speaking to herself, she entered a large open space with a little house in it, about 4 feet high. "Whoever lives here," thought Alice, "would be really frightened if they were to meet me while I'm this height." So Alice began to eat the right-hand bit of mushroom again and did not go near the house until she had shrunk again. This time she was only about 9 inches tall. Chapter 6. A Strange Baby and Some Pepper. Alice stood looking at the house, wondering what to do. Suddenly, a well-dressed servant came running from the other side of the wood. Alice knew he was a servant because of his clothes. Although his clothes were all that looked like a servant's, looking at his face, she would have said he was a fish. The fish servant knocked loudly at the door, which was opened by another servant dressed in the same clothes. But this servant had a round face and large eyes like a frog. Even though they were a fish and a frog, both servants had hair that curled all around their heads. Becoming more curious every minute, she quietly walked out of the wood so that she could listen to their conversation. The fish servant produced a huge letter from under his arm. The letter was nearly as large as he was. He handed the letter over to the other servant, saying very seriously,
"For the Duchess, an invitation from the Queen to play croquet."
The frog servant repeated the words in the same serious tone, but he changed the words' order.
"From the Queen,"
he said,
"an invitation for the Duchess to play croquet."
Then they both stood looking at each other and bowed. As they did so, their curly hair got all tied up together. Alice found this such a funny sight that she had to run back into the wood to laugh loudly, so they would not hear her. When she came out, the fish servant had left, but the other one was sitting on the ground near the door. Alice walked quietly up to the door and knocked.
"Knocking at the door isn't of any use,"
said the frog servant.
"for two reasons. First, I'm on the same side of the door as you and can't open it for you. Secondly, they're inside making too much noise to possibly hear you."
Truly, there was an amazing amount of noise coming from inside. There was constant crying and sneezing. Also, every now and then, Alice could hear what seemed to be a terrible crash, as if dishes were being thrown about and broken to pieces. "Please, please," asked Alice, "how am I to get in then?"
"Well, I shall sit here,"
the frog servant remarked, not answering her question.
"at least until tomorrow."
Just then, the front door of the house opened. A very large plate came flying out and looked like it was heading straight at the frog servant's head. Fortunately, it flew past his nose and broke into several pieces against one of the trees behind him.
"Or next day, perhaps,"
the servant continued, paying no attention to what had just happened. "Oh, what's the use of talking to him?" Alice said, throwing her hands up in the air. "He's a perfect idiot." With that, she went inside the house and found herself standing in the middle of a large kitchen. The kitchen was full of smoke. On a three-legged stool sat the Duchess, holding a baby. The cook was leaning over a large pot of soup that was on the fire. "I really think there's too much pepper in that soup," Alice declared, and then she sneezed loudly. Not only in the soup, there was too much pepper in the air. Even the Duchess kept sneezing. The poor baby was also sneezing and then crying the next minute. There were only two creatures in the kitchen who didn't sneeze, the cook and a large cat, which was near the fireplace, smiling from ear to ear. "Could you please tell me," Alice asked the Duchess shyly, "why that cat is smiling like that?" "He's a Cheshire Cat," answered the Duchess impatiently, "and that's why. Pig!" Suddenly, Alice began to shake all over in fright, alarmed by the Duchess's high and unpleasant tone of voice. Then she realized that pig was addressed to the baby, so she gathered up her courage and continued. I didn't know that Cheshire Cats always smiled. In fact, I didn't even know that it was possible for cats to smile. Of course they can, replied the Duchess sharply, looking angrily at Alice. And most of them do. I don't know of a single cat that smiles, nor have I heard of any before, Alice said politely. You don't know very much, replied the Duchess. I'm sure about that. Alice thought that remark was very rude, so she decided to change the subject. The cook took the soup pot off the fire and began to throw everything that was in the house at the Duchess and the baby. Please, watch what you're doing, cried Alice, jumping about in fright. You don't want to hit the baby. With that, a large saucepan flew by, right over the head of the child. If everybody would just mind their own business, the Duchess ordered, the world would go around a great deal faster than it does. But the world going around faster wouldn't be a good thing, remarked Alice, anxious to show the Duchess her knowledge. You see, it takes only 24 hours for the world to turn on its axis. It would be very confusing if night and day went any faster. Speaking of axes, cried the Duchess as loud as she could, chop off her head. Alice looked at the cook to see if she had listened to the Duchess, but she was busy stirring the soup. All through their conversation, the Duchess, who seemed very upset, was singing a song to the baby she was holding. But at the end of each verse, she shook the child, making it cry so loudly that Alice could hardly hear the words. Here, you play with the baby, the Duchess said, almost throwing the child toward Alice. I have to go play croquet with the Queen. Alice was most ready to take good care of the baby after seeing it treated so badly. She rocked it softly in her arms. However, the more she looked at the baby, the stranger it seemed. She couldn't help but notice the turned-up nose, which looked more like an animal's nose than a baby's nose. Not only that, but the baby's eyes were extremely small. When the infant began to make a noise, Alice thought it must be crying. So she looked into its eyes to see if there were any tears. But there weren't any. If you're suddenly going to become a pig, said Alice quite seriously, then I'll have nothing more to do with you. The next time the creature made a noise so loud and strange that Alice became alarmed. No mistake in it now. The baby had definitely turned into a pig. So Alice placed it on the ground and was quite happy to see it run away quietly into the wood. What an ugly child it would have grown into, Alice said to herself. But I think it makes a pretty handsome pig. As she started to walk away, Alice saw the Cheshire Cat sitting on the branch of a tree just a few feet away. The cat smiled very wide as soon as he saw Alice. He looked like he had a pleasant nature. Still, he also had very long claws and a great many teeth, so Alice thought it best to treat him with respect. Cheshire Puss, she began rather quietly, for she didn't know whether or not he would like the name. However, the cat, even though his smile was already wider than any Alice had ever seen, only smiled more. Well, he must be pleased, guessed Alice, so she continued. Could you tell me, please, where I should go from here?
That really depends largely on where you want to go,
said the cat. I don't really much care where, said Alice.
Then why are you worried about which way you go?
Said the cat, before Alice could even finish her sentence. I just want to get somewhere else, Alice explained.
Oh, I'm sure you can easily do that,
remarked the cat.
If you walk long enough.
Tell me, Alice asked, what kind of people live around here?
Over there,
said the cat, showing the direction with his right paw.
Lives a hatter, and in that direction,
he said, waving the other paw,
lives the March Hare. Go and visit whichever one you like. They're both mad.
But I don't want to visit crazy people, Alice remarked.
Oh, there's nothing you can do about that,
explained the cat.
We are all mad here. I'm mad, you're mad.
And how do you know I'm mad? Asked Alice.
You must be mad,
said the cat.
Otherwise, you wouldn't have ended up here.
Alice didn't think the cat's argument proved anything at all. However, she continued. How do you know that you're crazy?
To begin with,
said the cat,
a dog's not crazy. Do you agree with me?
I guess so, said Alice.
Well then,
the cat continued,
a dog, when it's angry, growls. A dog moves its tail when it's pleased. Now, I growl when I'm pleased, and my tail moves when I'm angry. Therefore, I must be crazy.
That's purring, not barking, said Alice.
Call it whatever you like,
said the cat.
Are you going to play croquet with the Queen today?
I'd like to, said Alice, but to be honest, I haven't been invited yet.
Look for me at the croquet game,
said the cat, smiling, and disappeared right in front of her eyes. Chapter 7. A Mad Tea Party. Alice was not too surprised when the cat disappeared because by now strange things seemed rather normal to her. While she was still looking at the tree branch where he had been sitting, her new furry friend suddenly appeared again.
By the way, whatever happened to the baby?
He asked. It turned into a pig, Alice answered. It didn't even surprise her that the cat had suddenly appeared again. In fact, it seemed perfectly natural.
I thought it would,
said the cat, and disappeared again. Alice waited a little while to see if he was going to reappear. When he did not, she walked in the direction of the March Hare's house. Perhaps since this month is May, he won't be completely mad, Alice said to herself. At least, maybe he won't be as mad as he was in March. As she spoke, she looked up, and there was the cat again, sitting on another tree branch.
Sorry to bother you, but did you say pig or fig?
Asked the cat. I said pig, replied Alice. I do wish you wouldn't keep appearing and disappearing all the time. Goodness, you're making me feel dizzy.
As you wish,
replied the cat. This time he disappeared slowly, beginning with the end of his tail and ending with the smile. The smile remained for a while, even after his body had already gone. Well, I've seen many a cat without a smile, thought Alice. But a smile without a cat? I'm sure it's the most curious thing I've ever seen in my life." There was a house not too far away, whose chimneys were shaped like ears, and whose roof was covered with fur. Alice was quite certain that this was the March Hare's house. It was such a big house, so she did not want to approach it until she had eaten some more of the left-hand bit of mushroom. The mushroom bit made her grow to a height of 2 feet. There was a large tree with a table underneath it in the front yard, and the March Hare and the Hatter were having tea there. Between the two sat a dormouse who was completely asleep. His friends were resting their elbows on him as if he were a pillow. They were talking to one another over his head. "That must be very uncomfortable for the dormouse," thought Alice. "But since he's asleep, I guess he doesn't mind." Even though the table was large, the 3 friends were sitting together crowded into one corner.
"There's no room! No room!"
they shouted together when they saw Alice approaching. "What are you talking about? There's plenty of room," said Alice, feeling quite in the right, and she sat down in a large armchair at the end of the table.
"Have some wine,"
the March Hare offered politely. Alice looked around the table, but there was no wine. There was nothing on it but tea. "I don't see any wine," she remarked.
"That's because there isn't any,"
said the March Hare. "Then it wasn't very polite of you to offer it," Alice said, more than a little bothered.
"It wasn't very nice of you to sit down without an invitation,"
replied the March Hare. "I didn't know this was only your table," answered Alice. "There are places set for more people than 3. Alice's remark made the Hatter open his eyes very wide, but all he said was,
"Why is a black bird like a writing desk?"
"I think I can guess the answer to that question," she said.
"Do you mean that you think you can find out the answer?"
said the March Hare. "Exactly," said Alice.
"Then you should say what you mean,"
replied the March Hare. "I do," Alice quickly answered. "At least, I mean what I say. That's the same thing, you know."
No, it isn't,"
cried the Hatter.
"Why, you might as well say that I see what I eat is the same thing as I eat what I see. You might just as well say,"
added the Dormouse, who seemed to be talking while he was sleeping,
"that I breathe when I sleep is the same thing as I sleep when I breathe. Well, we know that it's all the same to you,"
laughed the Hatter. This remark made him and the March Hare laugh very loudly. All of a sudden, the conversation stopped, and the party was quite silent for a minute. During this time, Alice was trying to remember everything she knew about blackbirds and writing desks. She realized she didn't know very much. The Hatter was the first to speak.
"What day of the month is it?"
he asked Alice. Taking his watch out of his pocket, he began to look at it unhappily. So often he shook it and held it up to his ear. "Today is the 4th, Alice said.
"You're off by 2 days,"
sighed the Hatter.
"I told you that putting butter inside my watch would damage it,"
he added, looking angrily at the March Hare.
"But it was the best butter I could find,"
the March Hare replied.
"Yes, but some small pieces of cake must have gotten inside as well," the
Hatter said. The March Hare took the watch from the Hatter and dipped it into his teacup.
It was the best butter, you know.
What a strange watch, Alice remarked, looking over the shoulders of the March Hare. It tells the day of the month, but it doesn't tell the time.
Does it have to?
Asked the Hatter.
I bet your watch doesn't tell you what year it is.
Of course it doesn't, Alice replied at once. But that's because it's the same year for a very long time.
This is exactly the case with mine,
said the Hatter. Alice was terribly confused. Even though she was certain that the Hatter was speaking English, his remark didn't make any sense. I really can't understand what you're saying, she said, trying to be polite.
The dormouse is sleeping again,
said the Hatter, and he began to pour hot tea on the poor fellow's little nose. The dormouse just shook his head from side to side. Impatiently, without opening his eyes, he said,
Of course, that's just what I was going to say myself. So, have you figured out the answer to the question yet?
asked the Hatter, turning to Alice again. No, I give up, Alice replied. Tell me the answer.
Well, I don't know the answer,
said the Hatter, smiling.
Nor do I,
said the March Hare. Alice sighed. She was beginning to feel tired. Don't you have something better to do with your time, she said, than sit and ask questions that don't have any answers?
Your idea of time is not the same as mine. If it were,
said the Hatter,
you wouldn't talk about wasting it. It's him, you know.
No, I don't understand what you mean, said Alice.
Of course you don't,
said the Hatter. He seemed to be getting impatient with Alice's lack of understanding.
I dare say you never even spoke to time.
You're right, Alice replied cautiously. I only know I have to beat time when I'm learning music.
Ha! That explains everything,
said the Hatter.
Time doesn't like to be beaten. I mean, would you like a beating? Now, if you only tried to be nice and good to him, he'd do almost anything you liked. Let's suppose it was 9 o'clock in the morning. You have to open your school books and start working. But if you had a friendly relationship with time, you could tell him your wish, and he'd make the clock move forward in a second. Soon, the clock would be 1:30, which is time for lunch.
That would be great, said Alice, thinking about the idea. But then I wouldn't be hungry.
It might take a while to get used to,
said the Hatter.
But you could keep the clock at 1:30 as long as you wished.
Is that how you handle time? Alice asked. The Hatter sadly shook his head.
Not I,
he replied.
Time and I had an argument last March, just before he went mad.
Pointing at the March Hare with his teaspoon.
It was at a concert given by the Queen of Hearts, and I had to sing. Twinkle, twinkle, little bat, how I wonder what you're at. Do you know the song by any chance?
I think I know one that's similar, said Alice.
It goes on, you know,
the Hatter continued.
Like this. Up above the world you fly, like a tea tray in the sky. Twinkle, twinkle.
Here the Dormouse moved himself about and began to sing in his sleep.
Twinkle, 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 twinkle.
He continued to sing these same words for so long that they had to pinch him to make him stop.
Just when I had finished the first verse,
said the Hatter,
the Queen yelled, He's murdering time! Off with his head! Ever since then, time won't do anything I ask him to. Now the clock always stays at 6 o'clock.
Alice had been thinking to herself during the Mad Hatter's story about time. All of a sudden, she had a very bright idea. "Be quiet, everyone," she said. She tapped her spoon against the glass pot to get everyone's attention. The others looked at her in great surprise, wondering how she could possibly have an idea about time. Truth be told, Alice had even surprised herself. She knew that to come up with a new idea was quite an achievement. She had been taught this at school, but it was even more great to be able to have an idea in the middle of such strange thinking creatures. In fact, the idea seemed to Alice to be even more extraordinary than all the things that had happened ever since she arrived here. Chapter 8. Back to the Start. Alice looked at each one of them. "I suppose the reason why so many teacups and plates are always on the table is because it's always 6 o'clock?" she asked.
"Yes, you're right,"
said the Hatter with a sigh.
"It's always tea time, and we don't ever have enough time to wash all the cups and plates."
"And you have to keep moving to different parts of the table?" asked Alice.
"Exactly,"
said the Hatter.
"We must move when things get used up."
"So, what happens when you get back to the same place you started from?" The March Hare interrupted because he was getting bored.
"I'm getting tired of talking about tea time. Let's do something else. I suggest that the young lady tell us a nice story."
Even though it was quite rude, Alice was alarmed by the March Hare's remark. She didn't continue with her idea about the tea table, but instead changed the subject and said simply, "I'm sorry, but I'm afraid I don't know a good story."
"Then the Dormouse can tell us a story,"
cried the Hare and the Hatter.
"Hey, wake up, Dormouse!"
And they started to pinch him on both sides together. The Dormouse quite slowly opened his eyes, yawned, and replied,
"I wasn't asleep. I heard every word you were saying. So then be quick and tell us a story,"
said the March Hare.
"Yes, you'd best be quick,"
added the Hatter,
"or you'll fall asleep again before you finish. Once upon a time, there were 3 sisters.
The Dormouse began quickly.
Their names were Elsie, Lacey, and Tilly, and they lived at the bottom of a well."
"What was it they lived on?" asked Alice. Being quite simple at times, she was always interested in what people ate or drank. After thinking for a minute, the Dormouse said,
"They lived on treacle."
"That's impossible," Alice remarked. "Treacle is a medicine. You eat treacle when you want to stop poison from harming you. If the sisters were eating treacle, they'd be sick all the time."
"They were,"
said the Dormouse.
"very ill indeed."
"Why did they live at the bottom of a well?" Alice wanted to know. The Dormouse again took a minute or two to think about it. Then he remarked,
"It was a treacle well."
"There's no such thing as a treacle well," Alice cried angrily. The Dormouse's feelings were hurt by Alice's remark.
"If you can't be polite,"
he said,
"you can finish the story yourself."
"No, do go on," Alice said, trying to make him feel better. I promise I won't interrupt you again.
In that case,
said the Dormouse, for he was quite stubborn. However, he decided to continue.
And so these three sisters were learning to draw, you know.
And what did they draw? Asked Alice, who had forgotten to keep her promise.
Treacle,
said the Dormouse.
I need a clean cup,
interrupted the Hatter.
Let's all move one place around the table.
The Hatter moved, followed by the Dormouse. Now the March Hare moved into the Dormouse's place, and Alice moved into the seat of the March Hare. In all this moving over one place, the Hatter was the only one who actually benefited. Poor Alice was worse off, as the March Hare had just spilled milk all over his plate. Not wanting to upset the Dormouse again, Alice spoke very quietly. Sorry, I don't understand. Where did the three sisters draw the treacle from?
You can draw water out of a water well,
said the Hatter.
So I would think you could draw treacle out of a treacle well, eh, stupid?
But they were in the well, Alice said to the Dormouse. One has to be out of a well to draw anything from it.
I said before they were in the well,
said the Dormouse.
They were learning to draw a whole manner of things. Everything that begins with an M, such as mouse traps, the moon, memory, and muchness. You know, you say that things are much of a muchness. Did you ever see such a thing as a drawing of a muchness?
Well, now that you ask me, said Alice, who was very confused because of the word draw, replied, I don't think...
Then you shouldn't talk,
said the Hatter. Alice couldn't stand any more of their rude behavior, so she stood up angrily and walked away. She looked back once or twice. She was rather hoping the Hatter and the Hare would call after her and ask her to come back. However, the last time she looked back at them, she saw they were trying to make the Dormouse fit into the teapot. I'll never go back there again, Alice said, walking through the wood. That was certainly the most stupid tea party I've ever been to. I'm sure it'll be the most stupid tea party I'll ever go to in my life. In the wood, she came upon a tree that had a front door. That's very curious, she said, but everything's curious here. I may as well see what's inside. Once again, just as in the beginning of her adventure, Alice was in the long hall and near the same little glass table. I'll do better this time, now that I know what to do, she said to herself. First, she took the golden key and unlocked the door that led into the garden. She ate a little piece of the mushroom she had kept in her pocket until she was about a foot high. Being only a foot tall, she was able to walk down the little passage to the garden. Soon, delighted and amazed, Alice arrived among the bright flower beds and cool fountains of the beautiful garden. There was a large rose tree at the entrance of the garden. The roses were white, but there were 3 gardeners busily painting the petals with red paint. This was very strange to Alice, and she decided to walk up and ask what they were doing. Just as she was ready to ask, she heard one of them say,
Look out, Five! Don't be covering me with paint like that. Sorry, but it wasn't my mistake,
said Five.
7 bumped against my elbow.
Hearing that, 7 looked up and said,
Oh, that's right, 5. You never say it's your own mistake. You'd better watch out,
said 5.
Yesterday I heard the Queen say you ought to lose your head. What for?
Asked the one who had spoken first. His name was 2.
That's none of your business, 2,
said 7.
He has a right to know,
said 5.
So I'll tell him. It was because I brought the cook flower bulbs instead of onion bulbs. How was I to know?
7 threw down his brush and said,
Well, that's not right to get angry with you for such a simple mistake.
Suddenly, he spotted Alice in the garden. With a wave of his arm, they bowed low to Alice. Could you please let me know, asked Alice, why you are painting those white roses red? 5 and 7 didn't say a word. They just looked at 2, who said in a low voice,
Why, the truth is, Miss the Queen wanted a red rose tree, but we put in a white one. It's a terrible mistake, and if the Queen finds out, she'll make the soldiers cut our heads off. So we are trying our best before she arrives to...
Just then, 5, who had been nervously looking around, called out,
The Queen! The Queen!
Instantly, 5, 7, and 2 threw themselves flat on their faces upon the ground. There was a sound of footsteps in the distance. Alice wasn't nervous, though, because she was eagerly looking forward to seeing the Queen. First, 10 soldiers came. They were carrying clubs, and they were the same shape as the gardeners, long and flat like a pack of cards, with their hands and feet at their corners. Next came 10 courtiers, or attendants in the royal court. These attendants were covered in diamond figures. They also walked 2 by 2, just like the soldiers. Meanwhile, the 10 royal children were holding hands and dancing happily along after the attendants. The children were all covered with hearts. Then came the guests of the royal family, and these were mostly kings and queens. They looked very fine indeed. In their company was the White Rabbit, who was running about and talking nervously. Still, he kept smiling at everything that anybody said. To Alice's surprise, he didn't even notice her, but went running on by. The Knave of Hearts was carrying the king's crown on a soft red cushion. He proudly marched along behind the rabbit. Last but not least, in this wonderful company were the King and Queen of Hearts. Alice was wondering if she should fall down on her face like the 3 gardeners. Actually, she could not remember hearing of such a rule even before a royal family. Besides, she thought, what good is it to have a parade if people don't get to see it? So she decided to stand still and wait. When the royal party came up to Alice, they all stopped, looking at her very strongly. Alice could feel her heart beating quickly, and her legs started to shake. She was even having trouble breathing, and she felt dizzy. For a moment, she was afraid she would faint. Suddenly, the Queen turned to the Knave of Hearts, and pointing at Alice, cried loudly, "Who, pray tell, is she?" Suddenly, everybody turned to look at Alice. She had never been so frightened in her whole life. She could hardly speak, even though she knew that the Queen of Hearts had asked her name and was waiting impatiently for her answer. Chapter 9. A Game of Croquet for the Queen. "My name is Alice, if you please, Your Majesty," nervously answered Alice. She had to use all of her courage, and she almost forgot to bow politely. Then she realized they were only a pack of cards, after all. She thought, "I needn't be afraid of them." "And who are these workers?" asked the Queen. She was pointing to the gardeners, who were still laying face down around the white rose tree they were trying to paint red. Because the pattern on their backsides was the same as all the rest of the pack, she wasn't able to tell whether they were gardeners, soldiers, courtiers, or even 3 of her own children. Quite rudely, Alice answered, "How should I know?" She was surprised at her new courage. "It's no business of mine," she continued, not able to stop herself from being impolite. The Queen turned red with anger and screamed, "Off with her head!" "Nonsense!" cried Alice loudly. All of a sudden the Queen became silent.
"Remember my dear wife,"
the King whispered to the Queen.
"She is just a young girl."
He touched her gently on the arm to calm her down. But it didn't work, and the Queen angrily addressed the 3 gardeners, who were still lying flat on their faces, on the ground. "Get up!" she shouted in a loud, high voice. Immediately, 2, 5, and 7 jumped to their feet. They began bowing to the King, the Queen, and all the royal children. After they finished, they started bowing to everyone else, even Alice again. "What are you doing here by this rose tree?" asked the Queen, as she examined the rose tree carefully, making them very nervous.
"If it pleases your Majesty,"
said 2, bending down on one knee as he spoke.
"We were just trying—"
"I see," answered the Queen, extremely angry. She had discovered that the roses had been painted. Immediately she shouted, "Off with their heads!" With that, the company continued on their walk, but 3 soldiers stayed behind, looking for 2, 5, and 7. Meanwhile, the unlucky gardeners had rushed to Alice's side for protection. "Don't worry, nobody's going to chop off your heads," promised Alice. She quickly hid them in a large pot that stood beside her. The 3 soldiers looked all around for a minute or 2, but they weren't able to find the gardeners. Finally, they decided to march off after the others. "Did you cut their heads off?" shouted the Queen so loudly that Alice's ears hurt.
"If it pleases you, yes, their heads are gone,"
the soldiers answered in reply. "How wonderful!" cried the Queen. "Do you know how to play croquet, my dear?" "Yes," said Alice, glad to be talking about something else after such an unpleasant situation. "Well, come on then," roared the Queen. Alice went and joined the royal company.
"Isn't it? Isn't it a fine day?"
said a quiet voice at her side. Alice looked down and saw the White Rabbit looking up at her. "It most certainly is," said Alice. She was quite happy to speak to the rabbit, especially as he seemed not to remember who she was. "Where is the Duchess?" Alice asked.
"The Queen's decided to cut her head off,"
whispered the rabbit. He looked anxiously over his shoulder, as if he expected to have his own head cut off for speaking about it. "What for?" asked Alice.
"Because she hit the Queen's ears,"
the rabbit began. Alice couldn't help but give a little scream of laughter.
"Oh, do be quiet,"
the rabbit warned.
"The Queen will hear you."
But the Queen was too busy setting up the game. "Take your places, everyone," she shouted, and soon the game began. What a strange croquet court! The field was made completely of edges and lines. It was totally impossible to hit the ball straight. Besides that, the croquet balls were hedgehogs and the mallets were real flamingos. There weren't any arches, so the soldiers had to bend over and stand on their heads and feet to form them. The soldiers were the biggest difficulty for Alice. None of them would stand still long enough for her to play the game. Also, all the players were all playing at once. They didn't wait for their turns, and some started to fight for the hedgehogs, which really should have been balls. All of this made the queen very upset, and she went marching around yelling, "Off with his head!" and "Off with her head!" Alice began to feel a little nervous. She was afraid that soon the queen might look at her and shout, "Off with her head!" "What's to become of me?" she worried. "They seem to really like cutting people's heads off around here. I'm quite amazed that anyone is still alive." She started looking around for a way to escape to someplace safe. Maybe it wasn't such a good idea to come back to this garden after all, said Alice to herself. But just then, she noticed a strange and curious thing in the air. She watched closely for a minute or two. Then she realized it was a very familiar smile. "Why, it's the Cheshire Cat!" she cried, clapping her hands together in delight. "Now at least I shall have somebody nice to talk to."
"How are things going for you, my dear?"
asked the cat. This took a while for enough of his mouth to appear so that he could speak. Alice waited until his eyes appeared and then nodded her head. "I don't think it'll be any good speaking to him just yet," she thought. "His ears haven't even arrived yet." In a minute, the whole head appeared, and Alice began to tell him about the croquet game. "It's not played very fairly at all," she complained. "They don't seem to have any rules, so everyone's fighting all the time. Also, you have the smallest idea how confusing it is having all the equipment in this game alive. For example, just look at the arch I've got to go through next. It's walking around at the other end of the field."
"Do you like the queen?"
whispered the cat. "Not in the least," replied Alice. "She's so very—" Luckily, she just noticed the queen standing right behind her, listening. Alice continued, "Likely to win that it's hardly worth finishing the game." The queen only smiled and happily walked by.
"Who is it you are talking to?"
asked the king. Standing beside Alice, he looked with great curiosity at the cat's head. Alice proudly replied, "Allow me to introduce the Cheshire Cat to you, sir."
"I don't like the way he looks at all,"
said the king.
"However, if he likes, he may kiss my hand." "I'd rather not, if you please,"
the cat remarked.
"Don't be so uncivilized,"
commanded the king.
"And don't look at me in that way."
For some reason, the king stood behind Alice as he spoke, as if he were afraid. "I've heard that a cat can look at a king," said Alice. "I've read it before, perhaps even in a book, but I don't remember where."
"Well, I won't stand for such rude behavior,"
cried the king.
"I am the king, after all,"
he said with great authority.
"My dear,"
he called to the queen,
"I wish you would get rid of this cat."
The queen, who was just passing by at that moment, cried, "Off with his head!" without even looking around. Eagerly, the king hurried off, saying,
"I'll fetch a soldier and see to it myself."
Alice thought it best to go back and see how the croquet game was coming along, but the players were even more confused than before. As a last try, she put her flamingo, who was always moving about and trying to escape, under her arm. But she noticed that a large crowd was standing around the Cheshire Cat. She could hear an argument happening between the soldier, the king, and the queen. They were all talking at once, while the crowd remained silent. When they saw Alice approaching, they rushed to her side to tell her their side of the argument, begging her to make a decision. Unfortunately, because they all talked at once, Alice couldn't understand a word that was said. The soldier argued that it was impossible to cut off a head without having a body. He stated quite strongly that he had never before done such a thing, and that he wasn't going to start doing it at this time of his life either. The king argued that anything with a head could have its head cut off. Whether or not it had a body made no difference at all. The queen kept shouting that if something wasn't done soon, she would start cutting off everyone's head. When she said this, the whole party became very silent and worried. Alice couldn't think of anything else to say but, "I think the cat belongs to the Duchess. You should go and ask her about it." "But she's in prison," the queen said to the soldier. "Well, if it will help end this matter quickly, then fetch her here." And the soldier quickly shot off like an arrow. Yet the cat's head began to fade away once the soldier had left. By the time the soldier had returned with the Duchess, the cat's head was completely gone. The king and the soldier started to run everywhere looking for it, all the while shouting,
"Where is it? Where is it?"
The rest of the party, seeing that no one's head was getting cut off, went back to play croquet. Chapter 10. Speaking to the Duchess. "You just can't imagine how terribly glad I am to see you again," said the Duchess. She put her arm in a friendly manner around Alice's, and they walked off together. Alice was quite happy to find the Duchess in such a good mood. She thought that perhaps the pepper had made her so rude and angry earlier when Alice had met her in the kitchen. "When I am a real Duchess," she said to herself, not sounding very hopeful though, "I won't have any pepper in my kitchen. I'm sure it's pepper that makes people get angry so easily," she went on, quite pleased with herself at having thought of a new rule, just as vinegar makes them sour and sugar makes them sweet. "You're thinking hard about something," said the Duchess a little loudly, right into Alice's ear, "and it makes you forget to talk. I'm not able to tell you just now what the lesson of that is, but I shall remember it soon." "Perhaps not saying anything doesn't have a lesson," Alice remarked. "Tut, tut, young dear," said the Duchess. "Everything's got a lesson. You've just got to find it." As she was speaking, she kept moving herself closer and closer to Alice. Soon she had squeezed up right against her. Alice didn't like this at all. First, the Duchess was very ugly. Second, the Duchess kept resting her chin on Alice's shoulder. What a terribly sharp chin it was, too. But Alice liked to be polite, so she accepted the situation and didn't say anything. "The game's going on quite well now," Alice said, trying to keep up the conversation so that the Duchess wouldn't start talking about lessons again. "Yes, it is," agreed the Duchess. "And the lesson of that is, oh yes, 'tis love that makes the world go round." "I'm sure somebody once said," Alice whispered, "that the world goes around by everybody minding their own business." "Ah, well, I'm sure it means the same thing," said the Duchess. She was digging her sharp little chin right into Alice's shoulder. "And the lesson of that is," said the ugly Duchess, "take care of the sense, and the sounds will take care of themselves." "How very much she likes to find lessons in things," Alice thought. She was trying very hard to understand this last remark. "I'm sure you are wondering why I'm standing so close to you instead of putting my arm around your waist," the Duchess said after a while. "You see, I'm not very sure that your flamingo is friendly. Shall I touch him and find out?" "He might bite you," Alice cautioned. She held the poor, tired bird tightly against her side. She did not want the Duchess to try such a dangerous experiment. "How very true," agreed the Duchess. "Flamingos and mustard both bite, and the lesson of that is, birds of a feather flock together." "But mustard isn't a bird," Alice pointed out. "You are right as usual," said the Duchess. "What a clear way you have of saying things." "Mustard is a rock, I think," Alice said. "Yes, of course it is," spoke up the Duchess. Now it seemed like she was trying to agree with everything that Alice said. "Speaking of which, I'm sure there's a large mustard mine over here. And the lesson of that is, the more there is of mine, the less there is of yours." "Oh, wait!" exclaimed Alice. She had stopped paying attention to what the Duchess was saying, so she continued. "Mustard is a vegetable. It doesn't look like a vegetable, but it is one." "I do agree with you," said the Duchess. "And the lesson of that is, be what you would seem to be, or, to say it simply, never imagine yourself not to be otherwise than what it might appear to others that what you were or might have been was not otherwise than what you had been would have appeared to them to be otherwise." "I'd understand that better," Alice said very politely, "if it were written down. I can't quite follow it as you say it because I need to read it." "What I've just said is nothing compared to what I could say if I chose to," the Duchess replied. She was very proud of herself, and she fixed her hair to keep it in place. "Please, don't put yourself through the trouble of saying anything longer than that," begged Alice. "Oh, it's no trouble," cried the Duchess. "I'll even give you a present made of everything I've said up to now." "That's a cheap present," thought Alice. "I'm glad the people I know don't give birthday presents like that." But she didn't say anything, as she was careful to keep her thoughts to herself and not be impolite. "Are you thinking again?" asked the Duchess. Again she dug her sharp little chin into Alice's shoulder. "I can think if I want to. It's my right," said Alice impolitely. She was beginning to feel that being polite was not so important any more. "Just about as much right," said the Duchess, "as pigs have to fly. And the less—" But to Alice's great surprise, and also her relief, the Duchess's voice stopped in the middle of her favorite word, lesson. Alice could feel the Duchess's arm begin to shake. Looking up, she saw the Queen standing in front of them, frowning and unhappy like a thunderstorm. "Isn't it a fine day, Your Majesty?" the Duchess said in a low, weak voice. "Now I give you a chance," shouted the Queen. She was stamping her foot on the ground out of anger. "Either your or her head must be off," she yelled. "Take your choice." The Duchess quickly decided and hurried right off. "Let's continue the game then, shall we?" said the Queen to Alice. Alice could only agree out of fright. She obediently followed the Queen back to the croquet field. In the Queen's absence, the other guests had decided to rest for a while in the shade. But the moment they saw her approaching, they hurried back to the field. The Queen loudly warned them that resting could cost them their lives. During the rest of the game, the Queen never stopped arguing with the other players. "Off with his head!" or "Off with her head!" she continued to shout. The people who were getting their heads chopped off were taken away by the soldiers. This meant that the soldiers had to leave their jobs as croquet archers. It wasn't long before no arches were left at all. Also, all the players, except the King, the Queen, and Alice, had been taken away by the soldiers, waiting to have their heads cut off. The Queen, quite out of breath from yelling and screaming, went up to Alice and asked, "Have you seen the Mock Turtle yet?" "No," cried Alice in surprise. "I don't think I even know what a Mock Turtle is." "It's what Mock Turtle soup is made from," explained the Queen. "Yes, I'm sure that's true, perhaps, Your Majesty, but I never saw one or heard of one," said Alice. "Well then," said the Queen, "here's a chance for you to meet one. He can tell you the story of his life." As they walked away, Alice heard the King say to all the people that they were all forgiven and wouldn't have their heads chopped off. "Well, I'm glad for that," Alice said to herself. She took in a deep breath and relaxed. She realized that she had been quite unhappy and worried over the large number of head choppings that the Queen had ordered. After walking for a good while, the Queen and Alice came upon a griffin who was lying fast asleep in the sun. Now the griffin was an interesting creature and the most unusual one. It had the head, wings, and feet of an eagle, but the body and the back end of a lion. It even had a tail. Alice had only heard of a griffin before in stories, but she knew that many people believed griffins had the combined qualities of both an eagle and a lion, watchfulness and courage. The Queen, of course, was not like most people. "Get up, you lazy thing!" she rudely shouted to the creature. "Take this young lady to meet the Mock Turtle. She needs to hear his story." "Excuse me, dear," she said to Alice. "I must return to the game and see about those executions I ordered." She walked off and left Alice alone with the griffin. Chapter 11. The Story of the Mock Turtle. Alice didn't like the look of the griffin, but she reasoned it was safer to stay with the griffin than to run after the angry Queen. She sat down on a rock and looked at the griffin. The griffin had woken up from its nap when the Queen shouted at him. Now it rubbed its eyes and watched the Queen leaving.
"What fun!"
it laughed when the Queen was out of sight. "What do you mean by that, fun?" asked Alice.
"It's really all the Queen's imagination,"
said the griffin.
"They never executes nobody, you know. Come on, then."
Well, the Gryphon may have watchfulness and courage, Alice thought, but he certainly doesn't have very good grammar. Why is it that everybody says, "Come on," here? Thought Alice, walking slowly after the creature. I've never been ordered about so much before in my life. Soon they came upon the Mock Turtle, who was sitting sad and lonely on a little rock. Getting close to him, Alice could hear him sighing so sadly that it sounded like his heart would break. She suddenly felt very sorry for him. "How come he is so unhappy?" she asked. And the Gryphon used almost the same words he had said before.
It's all his imagination, really. He hasn't got no sorrow, you know. Come on.
There's that order again, thought Alice. But she forgot her complaint when she saw that the Mock Turtle was sitting there with large eyes full of tears.
This here young lady,
announced the Gryphon.
She wants to know the story of your life, she do. Then I'll tell it to her,
said the Mock Turtle in a tone that was deep and hollow.
Sit down, both of you, and please don't speak anything until I've finished.
So they sat down, but nobody said anything for several minutes. Alice thought, I don't see how he can finish if he doesn't ever begin. Still, she waited patiently, sitting in a very ladylike way with her hands folded on her lap.
Once upon a time,
said the Mock Turtle at last, with a deep sigh,
I was a real turtle.
Again there was a silence, broken only by a sound of
Abridged
from the Gryphon and the crying and the sighing from the Mock Turtle. Alice was quite ready to get up and say, Thank you, sir, for your interesting story, but she thought it would be very impolite indeed. So she continued to sit still and say nothing.
When we were young children,
the Mock Turtle started at last. He spoke more calmly, but he still sobbed every now and then.
We would go to school in the sea. The teacher was an old turtle. We used to call him Tortoise.
But why did you call him Tortoise if he wasn't a tortoise but a turtle? Alice asked.
We called him Tortoise because he taught us,
the Mock Turtle answered. It seemed he believed himself quite correct over this matter.
Really, you are a little slow in the head,
he added.
You ought to feel quite ashamed for asking such a simple question,
added the Gryphon. He was moving his tail back and forth angrily. Alice almost remarked that it reminded her of her cat Dinah. But she fell silent, and when they stared at her, she wished that she could be covered up by the earth. The Gryphon said to the Mock Turtle,
Do continue, old fellow. Don't be all day about it. Yes, even though it's hard to believe, we did indeed go to school in the sea,
the Mock Turtle said. I never said you didn't, interrupted Alice.
You most certainly did,
insisted the Mock Turtle.
Be quiet,
cried the Gryphon angrily before Alice could speak again.
We all had the best of educations,
continued the Mock Turtle.
In fact, we went to school every day.
I've also been to day school as well, Alice spoke up. It's nothing to be so proud of.
Were there extras?
Anxiously asked the Mock Turtle. Yes, there were extras, said Alice, like French and music class.
And washing?
asked the Mock Turtle. Certainly not, said Alice, who had never heard of washing as a class. but was quite proud she didn't have to take it in school.
Ah, then yours wasn't really a good school,
said the Mock Turtle, greatly relieved.
Now, at our school, they had French, music, and washing for the extras.
I don't think anyone would need or want washing as a class, said Alice, especially since you lived at the bottom of the sea.
Well, I didn't have enough money to take the class,
said the Mock Turtle with a sigh.
You see, I could only take the regular course.
What was in the regular course? Inquired Alice. She moved closer to the Mock Turtle to try to understand everything he was saying.
Reeling and writhing to begin with,
the Mock Turtle replied.
And then we had the different branches of arithmetic: ambition, distraction, uglification, and disrespect.
I don't know what uglification is, said Alice. She couldn't understand this. The Gryphon stood on his legs and threw both his paws over his head in surprise.
Never heard of uglifying,
it said.
You know what it is to beautify, right?
Yes, said Alice slowly. It means to make anything prettier.
Well then,
the Gryphon went on,
you should know what it means to uglify. If you don't, then you really are too simple.
The Gryphon's mean remarks stopped Alice from asking any more questions. She turned quickly to the Mock Turtle and asked, What else did you learn?
Well, there was mystery,
the Mock Turtle replied. He started to count off subjects on his flappers.
Mystery, ancient and modern seaography, then drawing, stretching, and fainting in coils.
What were those like? Asked Alice.
Well, I'm not able to show you myself,
the Mock Turtle said.
My body's too stiff, and the Gryphon never learned those in school. Didn't have the time,
the Gryphon explained.
I took the classics course instead. The teacher was an old crab. He was. I never went to his class,
the Mock Turtle sighed.
He taught the classes laughing and grief. That he did,
said the monster, who was also now sighing. This time both he and the Mock Turtle covered their faces with their paws. So how many hours did you go to school in a day, then? Alice asked.
It was 10 hours the first day,
answered the Mock Turtle.
Then 9 hours the next, and so on.
What a strange schedule for lessons, said Alice. She never stopped being surprised at what they told her.
That's why they're called lessons,
explained the Gryphon.
Because they lessen from day to day.
This was a new idea to Alice. She thought about it for a while before speaking again. So, then the 11th day must have been a day off?
Of course it was,
said the Mock Turtle. And what did you do on the 12th day? Alice eagerly asked.
I think that's enough about those lessons,
the Gryphon interrupted.
You're going to make the Mock Turtle very upset.
Oh, I'm so sorry, dear Turtle, apologized Alice. But the Mock Turtle only sighed deeply, smoothing his forehead with the back of one of his flappers. He sadly looked at Alice, trying to speak, but his voice was too soft from crying.
It's like he has a bone in his throat,
said the Gryphon. He started to shake and hit the poor, sad turtle on the back. Finally, the Mock Turtle's voice returned, and with tears running down his face, he continued,
"Even though you may not have lived under the sea—"
"I haven't," said Alice.
"Maybe you've never been introduced to a lobster."
Alice started to say, "I once tasted one, but thought better of it," and instead answered, "No, never."
"Well, too bad. But I can tell you I mean what I say,"
the Mock Turtle replied. "I see," said Alice, who didn't see at all, in fact. She was just trying to figure out what a lobster had to do with the turtle's story, when the Gryphon suddenly said, sitting down beside Alice,
"Come, let's hear some of your adventures."
"I guess I could start with my adventures this morning," said Alice. "There's no point in starting from yesterday because I was a different person then." Alice began her story when she first came upon the White Rabbit. At first, she was a little nervous, but the two creatures came and sat beside her, listening with great interest. Soon, she became more brave and continued,
"It's a very strange story indeed,"
said the Gryphon, when Alice had finished.
"Could you repeat, because I'm not sure I follow you completely?"
"How these creatures here like to order me around," thought Alice. However, she started to repeat her story, but her head was so full of lobsters for some reason that she hardly knew what she was saying, and her words came out in a very strange way. "'Tis the voice of the lobster," I heard him declare. "You have baked me too brown, I must sugar my hair. As a duck with its eyelids, so he with his nose trims his belt and his buttons and turns out his toes. When the sands are all dry, he is gay as a lark, and will talk in hateful tones of the shark. But when the tide rises and sharks are around, his voice has a timid and shaky sound."
"Sounds like nonsense to me,"
said the Mock Turtle. Alice said nothing. She just sat down in the grass with her face in her hands, wondering if anything would ever happen again like it was supposed to.
"I think you'd better stop now,"
said the Gryphon, and Alice was only too glad to do so.
"Shall we try another story?
The Gryphon asked next.
Or would you like the Mock Turtle to sing you a song?"
"Oh, a song, please, if the Mock Turtle would be so kind," Alice replied.
I guess it would be too much to think you had any taste,"
said the Gryphon. He seemed hurt by Alice's request.
"Will you sing her Turtle Soup, old fellow?"
Just then they heard a cry in the distance of,
"The trial's beginning."
"We'd better hurry,"
cried the Gryphon. He grabbed Alice's hand and rushed off with her. Softly behind them, they could hear the Mock Turtle beginning the first chorus of his sad, tearful song.
"Beautiful soup, so rich and green, waiting in a hot bowl. Who for such food would not stoop? Soup of the evening, beautiful, beautiful soup."
But Alice was already thinking about what was going to happen next, and she didn't pay any attention to the poor turtle's complaint. It was pretty hard to pay attention to what was happening before something else, completely different, would happen. Soon, poor Alice wasn't even able to think. She had to use all her energy to keep up with the Gryphon as he pulled her along at top speed. Chapter 12. The Thief of Tarts. "What kind of trial are we going to?" Alice asked, quite out of breath as she ran beside the Gryphon. But the creature only answered,
"Come on!"
and ran faster. There was that order again, noted Alice, and it was all she could do to keep going the same speed as he. The King and Queen of Hearts were already seated on their royal thrones when Alice and the Gryphon entered, running into the courtroom, trying to calm their breathing. A huge crowd had gathered around them, all kinds of birds and animals, as well as the whole pack of cards. The knave, who was in chains, stood in front of the King and Queen, with a soldier on each side, to make sure he wouldn't escape. The white rabbit was near the king, and he had a trumpet in one hand and a rolled-up piece of paper in the other. There was a table that stood in the middle of the court with a dish of tarts, or small round fruit pies. They looked delicious and wonderful. Alice wanted to eat them suddenly. "I wish they'd hurry up and finish the trial," Alice thought, thinking about how hungry she was, "and start giving everyone food and drinks." But she knew there was no chance of this, so she began looking about her to take her mind off how hungry she was. Alice had never been inside a courtroom before, but she knew about them from the school books she had read. "That must be the judge," she said to herself, "because he's wearing that enormous wig on top of his head." The judge was actually the king. Unfortunately, the king didn't look very handsome with the wig, and he didn't look very comfortable either. He still wore the crown over the wig. "And that must be the jury box, or where the jury sits," thought Alice. "And I suppose those 12 creatures are the jury." Alice thought it best to say creatures, because some of the jury were animals and some were birds. All of them were busy writing notes on pieces of flat rocks. "Why are they doing that?" Alice asked the Gryphon. "Nothing's happened for them to write down anything yet."
"They're writing down their names,"
the Gryphon whispered,
"in case they forget them when the trial begins."
"How stupid," Alice said loudly.
"Silence in the court,"
cried the white rabbit. This caused the king to put on his glasses and try to see who was talking. From where she sat, Alice could see that all the jurors were writing down "how stupid" on their rocks. One of them didn't even know how to spell stupid and had to ask for help from his neighbor. "A fine mess his rock will be before the trial's finished," thought Alice. Bill the lizard, who earlier Alice had kicked in the rabbit's chimney, had a pencil that squeaked when he wrote on his rock. The noise bothered Alice's nerves so much that she finally went behind him and took the pencil out of his hand when he wasn't looking. He didn't seem to notice and kept on writing with his finger. Unfortunately, this didn't leave any marks on his rock.
"Messenger, read the charges,"
commanded the king. The white rabbit blew the trumpet and unrolled the piece of paper. He then read,
"The Queen of Hearts, she made some tarts, all on a summer day. The Knave of Hearts, he stole those tarts and took them clean away."
"Make your decision, jury,"
the king loudly instructed.
"Wait a minute, please,"
the rabbit interrupted.
"We have a lot of things to do before the jury makes a decision."
"Then call the first witness to the stand,"
said the king, and the white rabbit blew 3 more blasts on the trumpet and loudly called,
"First witness."
The first witness was the Mad Hatter. He had a teacup in one hand and a piece of bread and butter in the other when he walked in.
I do beg your pardon, your Majesty,
he began,
for carrying my tea with me, but I hadn't finished them yet when you sent for me. Why haven't you finished?
asked the king.
When did you begin your tea?
The Hatter took a quick look at the March Hare. The March Hare had followed him into the courtroom with the Dormouse on his arm.
14th of March, I think it was,
the Hatter said.
15th.
Corrected the March Hare.
16th.
Cried the Dormouse.
Better write that down,
the king instructed the jury. Happily, the jury wrote down the dates, added them up as if doing math exercises, and put the answer into shillings and pence.
Take off your hat,
the king said to the Hatter.
But it isn't mine,
the Hatter replied.
It is stolen, then,
the king shouted. He turned to look at the jury, who instantly wrote down that the Hatter's hat was a stolen one.
I keep hats because I sell hats,
the Hatter explained.
I don't have any hats of my own. I'm a hatter, after all. Let's hear what evidence you have to say,
the king said.
And don't get nervous. If you do, I'll have your head cut off right here.
This made the Hatter worse than before. He kept shifting from one foot to the other, looking uneasily at the Queen. Then, because he was so confused, he bit a large piece of his teacup instead of his bread and butter. Just then, Alice realized that she was getting larger and larger. "Oh dear," she said to herself, "perhaps I should leave." But then she decided to stay and watch the rest of the trial for as long as there was room for her.
For goodness sake, move over. You're squeezing me to death,
cried the Dormouse sitting next to her.
I can hardly breathe.
It's not that I want to squeeze you. I can't help it, Alice said, somewhat embarrassed. I'm growing again.
This isn't the time or place for you to grow,
said the Dormouse. Don't say such ridiculous things, Alice spoke up. You know you're growing all the time, too.
Yes, but I do so at a normal speed,
said the Dormouse.
Not in the ridiculous way you are now.
He angrily got up and walked over to the other side of the court. During this, the Queen had been looking very strongly at the Hatter. When the Dormouse crossed to the other side of the court, she suddenly said, "Bring me the list of singers in the last concert." This caused the unhappy Hatter to shake so badly that his shoes came off.
Tell me your evidence,
the king repeated angrily.
Or I'll have your head cut off, even if you're too nervous to speak. Please, your Majesty, I'm only a poor man.
The Hatter began shakily.
And I hadn't even begun my tea, and you know that bread and butter are hard to find, and the twinkling of the tea—
The twinkling of what?
asked the king.
It began with the tea,
the Hatter replied.
Of course, twinkling begins with a T,
said the king sharply.
Do you think I'm a fool?
Most things began to twinkle after that,
the Hatter continued.
Only the March Hare said,
I certainly did not.
The March Hare cried out behind him.
He says he did not,
said the king. The Hatter started worriedly looking around to see if the Dormouse would also say he was wrong, but the little fellow didn't say anything because he was completely asleep.
After that,
continued the Hatter,
I made some more bread and butter.
But did the Dormouse say anything?
asked one of the jurors.
I can't remember clearly,
said the Hatter.
You had better remember,
said the king,
or I'm going to have your head cut off. Please, I'm a poor man, Your Majesty,
began the Hatter. He dropped his teacup and bread and butter and bent down on one knee.
And also a very poor speaker,
said the king.
If this is all you can remember about the matter, you may get down from the stand. But I can't get any more down or lower,
said the Hatter.
I'm already on the floor as it is. Then go ahead and sit down,
the king replied.
Can't I finish my tea?
asked the Hatter. He looked at the Queen for help, but she was reading the list of singers.
Just leave immediately,
shouted the king. The Hatter rushed out of the courtroom without even putting his shoes back on.
Bring me the next witness,
said the king. The next witness was the Duchess's cook. Alice knew who it was even before she entered, because people near the door suddenly began sneezing from the can of pepper she was carrying with her.
Tell the court your evidence,
the king commanded. I certainly will not, replied the cook. The king looked uneasily at the white rabbit. The rabbit could only whisper back,
Your Majesty has to make this witness say something to the court. What are these tarts made of?
asked the king. He spoke in a deep voice to try to frighten the cook. Pepper, mostly, said the cook.
Treacle,
replied a soft, sleepy voice behind her. Cut off that dormouse's head, yelled the Queen. Run him out of this court. Off with his whiskers. During the next few minutes, the whole court was running about, trying to get rid of the dormouse. When they had finally settled down again, they noticed that the cook had disappeared as well.
No matter,
said the king. He was actually quite glad not to have to question the cook.
Call the next witness.
Quietly, under his breath, he told the Queen,
Please, my dear, try to get me a witness that will answer questions. This whole thing has given me a very big headache.
Alice saw the white rabbit look over the list. She was curious to know who the next witness was going to be. I guess they haven't got enough evidence yet, she thought. How surprised she was when the white rabbit read at the top of his high voice the name
Alice.
Chapter 13. Alice as a Witness. Here I am, cried Alice. Since she was so excited, she forgot how large she had grown in the last few minutes. When she jumped up in such a hurry, she caused the jury box to fall over because the edge of her skirt had caught on the box. This upset the whole jury, who were now lying about on the floor. Some members moved about, reminding Alice of the bowl of goldfish she had accidentally knocked over once before. Oh, I do beg your pardon, she said worriedly. She began picking them up as quickly as she could. Somehow she had been taken over by the strange idea that they must be put back in the jury box very quickly, or they would die, just like her goldfish.
We cannot go on with the trial,
said the king gravely,
unless the jury is back in their correct seats.
He then looked angrily at Alice. Alice looked and saw that, because she was hurrying, she had put Bill the lizard back in, head downwards. The poor little lizard was waving his tail wildly, unable to sit up. Alice quickly pulled him out again and set him right side up. Once the jury had gotten over the shock of being knocked over onto the floor, and their rocks and pencils had been returned, they started to write in great detail about their accident. Everyone, that is, except the lizard. He was much too upset to do anything. He just sat with his mouth open, looking up at the ceiling of the court as if he were in a dream.
"What do you know about the tarts?"
the king asked Alice. "Nothing," said Alice, quite honestly.
"Nothing?"
continued the king. He leaned forward and looked hard at her. "Nothing at all, Your Majesty," said Alice.
"That's very important,"
the king noted to the jury. The jury was trying to write this down, but the White Rabbit interrupted.
"Unimportant, Your Majesty means,"
he said respectfully. Yet he also frowned at the king and made funny faces at the same time, as if trying to tell the king something.
"That's right. I meant unimportant, of course,"
the king said. Then he quickly said to himself,
"Important, unimportant, important, unimportant."
It seemed he was trying to decide which word sounded best. This caused some of the jury to write down important and others unimportant. Alice was able to see this since she was so close to them. "Well, I suppose it really doesn't matter," she thought to herself.
"Silence!"
shouted the king. He started to read from his book.
Rule 42. All persons who are taller than a mile must immediately leave the court.
Everyone looked at Alice. "But I'm not 1 mile high," said Alice. "You're nearly 2 miles high," added the Queen. "Well, I'm not going," said Alice. "Besides, I'm sure that's not a real rule. You just made that up."
It's the oldest rule in the book,
said the king. He quickly slammed his book shut.
Think of your decision,
he instructed the jury.
"But some more evidence is arriving, Your Majesty,"
said the White Rabbit. Holding a piece of paper in his hand, he jumped up in a great hurry and said,
"This paper has just been delivered."
"What's this?" asked the Queen.
"I don't know. I haven't opened it yet,"
said the White Rabbit.
"It looks like a letter written by the prisoner to somebody."
Unless, of course, it was written to nobody,
said the king.
But that wouldn't be the usual way, you know.
"Who is it addressed to?"
asked one of the jurors.
"To no one at all,"
said the White Rabbit.
"In fact, there's nothing written on the outside of the letter."
He unfolded the paper and said,
"It isn't a letter. It's a poem."
"Is it the prisoner's handwriting in the poem?"
asked another juror.
"No, it isn't,"
said the White Rabbit.
"That's why it's so strange."
The jury was very puzzled at this point.
Maybe he copied somebody else's style of handwriting,
said the king. Hearing this, the jury became happy again.
"Please, Your Majesty,"
said the knave.
"I didn't write it. I'm telling the truth. Besides, you can't prove that I did. There's no name signed at the end of the poem." "If you didn't sign it,"
said the king,
"it's because you meant to cause some trouble. Otherwise, you would have signed your name like an honest man would."
Because this was the first clever and smart thing the king had said all day, everyone in the courtroom clapped their hands loudly. "That proves he is guilty," said the Queen. "So off with—" "It doesn't prove anything," said Alice. "You haven't even read the poem, so how could you even know what it is about?"
"Read it,"
ordered the king. The court was dead silent as the rabbit read,
"They told me you had been to her and mentioned me to him. She gave me a good character, but said I could not swim. He sent them word I had not gone. We knew it to be true. If she should push the matter on, what would become of you? I gave her 1, they gave him 2. You gave us 3 or more. They all returned from him to you, though they were mine before. If I or she should chance to be involved in this affair, he trusts to you to set them free, exactly as we were. My notion was that you had been, before she had this fit, a barrier that came between him and ourselves and it. Don't let him know she liked them best, for this must ever be a secret kept from all the rest, between yourself and me."
"Well, that's certainly the most important piece of evidence we've heard today,"
said the king. "There's not the slightest meaning in it," replied Alice. She had grown so large at this point that she wasn't afraid of interrupting the king any more. The king replied,
"That saves us a lot of trouble because we won't need to find any meaning in it. And yet,"
he continued, looking at the poem on his knee and reading the verses,
"I think I see some meaning in it after all. Said I could not swim. You can't swim, can you?"
he asked the knave. The knave sadly shook his head.
"Do I look like I can swim?"
This was a good point, as the knave was made of thick paper and really did not look like he could. The king went on reading.
"We knew it to be true. That would be the jury, right? If she should push the matter on, that must be the queen. What would become of you? I gave her 1, they gave him 2. Why, this is telling us what he did with the tarts after he stole them."
"But it says they all returned from him to you," said Alice.
"And there they are in front of us,"
said the king, pointing to the tarts on the table. He was quite excited at his discovery.
"Nothing is clearer than that. But before she had this fit— You never had any fits, my dear, did you?"
he asked the queen. "Never," cried the queen. She threw an ink bottle at Bill the lizard as she spoke. The unfortunate little Bill had stopped trying to write on his rock with his finger because he found it left no mark. He began to use the ink that was running down his face instead.
"Then the words don't describe you, dear queen,"
said the king, looking around the court with a smile. But nobody else was smiling.
"It's a pun,"
the king angrily said, which caused everybody to laugh.
"Let the jury make their decision then."
"No, no," said the queen. "First we have the sentence, then the jury's decision afterwards." "What nonsense!" cried Alice loudly. "The idea of having the sentence first!" "Be quiet!" yelled the queen, who was turning purple from Alice's shouting. "I certainly will not," said Alice against the queen's wishes. "Off with her head!" the queen shouted, but nobody in the court moved. "I'm not afraid of any of you," said Alice. By now, she had grown to her full size. "You're nothing but a pack of cards." Then The whole pack rose up suddenly into the air. They flew down on Alice. Screaming, Alice tried to fight them and hit them away. But instead, she found herself lying on the river bank, her head in the lap of her sister. Her sister was gently brushing away some dead leaves that had fallen down from the trees upon her face. "Do wake up, Alice dear," said her sister. "Why, you've been asleep for ages." "Oh, I've just had the strangest dream," replied Alice. Then she told her sister all her strange and wonderful adventures that you have been reading about. When she finished, her sister kissed her on the forehead and said, "It was certainly a strange dream. Now, you'd better go home and get your tea. I hope it's not too late." Alice got up and ran toward home, thinking, while she ran, just what a wonderful dream it had been. Down deep in her own heart, she knew that she'd remember it her whole life.